March 1945. The train wheels screeched against cold metal tracks as 247 German prisoners of war arrived at Fort Oglethorpe, Georgia. These men had fought in the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last big attack in the frozen forests of Europe. They were tired, they were dirty, and they were scared. For 12 years, Nazi leaders had told them that Americans were weak. For 12 years, they had been told that black people were less than human. For 12 years, they had been taught that women belonged in kitchens, not in uniforms. Everything they believed was about to break apart. Captain Ernst Weber stepped off the train first. He was 32 years old and had spent 8 years serving Nazi Germany. His uniform was torn and muddy. His boots had holes in them. He had not eaten a real meal in 3 weeks. Back home in Hamburg, his wife and 2 children were living in a basement, eating watery soup made from turnips. German civilians were surviving on just 1,200 calories each day. That was barely enough to keep a person alive. The Nazi government had promised them a 1,000-year empire. Instead, their cities were piles of broken stone and ash. Allied bombs had destroyed German factories, roads, and bridges. There was no food, there was no hope, and now Weber was a prisoner in enemy land. Fort Oglethorpe stretched out before him like a small city made of wood. Rows and rows of long brown buildings stood in perfect lines. Guard towers rose up every 100 yards, watching over 3,000 German prisoners already living there. The camp followed the Geneva Convention, the international rules about how to treat prisoners of war. America took these rules seriously, but Weber did not know that yet. He expected cruelty. He expected revenge. Nazi propaganda had spent years telling Germans that Americans, especially American soldiers, were brutal monsters who would torture captured enemies. The year 1945 was a strange time in America. The country was making half of all the things manufactured in the entire world. Factories ran day and night, building planes, tanks, jeeps, and guns. American farms grew so much food that the country fed its own people, its armies overseas, and its allies too. But America also had deep problems. In the South, where Fort Oglethorpe sat, Jim Crow laws forced black and white people apart. Black Americans could not eat at the same restaurants as white Americans. They could not use the same bathrooms or drink from the same water fountains. The US military itself kept black and white soldiers in separate units. Yet something unusual had happened in 1943. The Women's Army Corps, called the WAC, had started accepting women as real soldiers with real ranks. Some of these women were black, some became officers. This was revolutionary, even if most Americans did not realize it yet. Weber and his men shuffled toward the processing building. Their feet dragged, some limped from old wounds. They had been on ships for weeks, then trains for days. They smelled like sweat and fear. The March air was cool but not cold, much warmer than the frozen hell of the Ardennes where they had been captured. Pine trees surrounded the camp, and Weber could hear birds singing. It was almost peaceful, almost normal. That made everything feel even more strange. Then Weber saw them. 2 women stood at the entrance to the processing building. They wore US Army uniforms, perfectly pressed and clean. On their shoulders, gold bars caught the afternoon sunlight. Officer ranks, lieutenants, and captains. But these were not just women, they were black women. Weber stopped walking. His brain could not process what his eyes were seeing. Behind him, other German prisoners froze too. Someone laughed nervously. Another man whispered a curse in German. Lieutenant Mary Johnson was 28 years old. She had gone to college, which was rare for any woman in the 1,940 seconds, and even rarer for a black woman. She worked as the administrative supervisor, which meant she managed prisoner work assignments, schedules, and reports. She had seen this reaction before. Nearly every group of German POWs had the same shocked faces when they first arrived. She stood straight, holding her clipboard, waiting. Next to her stood Captain Ruth Williams, 35 years old, the personnel director for the camp. She was in charge of even more people and had even more responsibility. Her uniform displayed captain's bars, 2 gold bars side by side. In the military, captains outrank lieutenants. Captains give orders to lieutenants. and lieutenants give orders to everyone below them, including enlisted soldiers, corporals, and sergeants. Weber's mind raced. This could not be real. Nazi training had been clear. Black people were subhuman, according to Hitler's evil lies. They could not think clearly. They could not lead. They were meant to serve, not command. And women? Women were too emotional, too weak to be soldiers. Yet here stood two black women wearing officer uniforms in the United States Army. Either this was an elaborate joke, a cruel American trick to humiliate German prisoners, or everything Weber had been taught was a lie. He chose to believe it was a trick. Lieutenant Johnson stepped forward. Her voice was calm and professional. She told the prisoners to form 3 lines for processing. She explained they would receive medical checks, clean uniforms, and assignments to barracks. Her English was clear. Her instructions were simple. But Weber and his men did not move. They stood like statues, staring. Some smirked. One young lieutenant muttered in German that this was a joke, that these women were probably cleaning ladies dressed up to make fools of the Germans. Weber said nothing, but he agreed. He refused to take orders from them. He would wait for the real officers to arrive. Surely real officers, white men with authority, would come soon. This uncomfortable moment would end, and things would make sense again. Lieutenant Johnson did not look angry. She did not look surprised. She had dealt with this before. She simply turned her head and called out in a clear, strong voice for Corporal Stevens. What happened next would change everything. Weber thought he knew about the world. A white soldier jogged over from the guard station. He wore the uniform of an enlisted man, someone low in military rank. 2 stripes sat on his sleeve, marking him as a corporal. That meant he was below sergeants, below lieutenants, below captains. In the military, everyone knows their place. Lower ranks always salute higher ranks. It is a sign of respect and a rule that cannot be broken. Corporal Stevens reached Lieutenant Johnson, stopped exactly 3 feet away, and brought his right hand up sharply to his forehead in a perfect salute. His back was straight, his boots clicked together. His voice was clear and respectful when he said, "Yes, ma'am." Weber felt like the ground had dropped away beneath his feet. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. Around him, other German prisoners stared with wide eyes. The Nazi lies had told them that white people would never serve black people. The propaganda had promised that America was weak because it mixed races together. But here, right in front of them, a white American soldier was saluting a black woman officer with genuine respect. This was not pretend. This was not a joke. This was real. Lieutenant Johnson gave Corporal Stevens quick instructions about where to direct the new prisoners. He nodded, saluted again, and said, "Right away, ma'am." Then he turned to the Germans and firmly told them to follow him. This time, they moved. Their legs felt heavy, like walking through mud, but they followed. Their entire understanding of the world had just cracked like thin ice under heavy boots. Another white soldier passed by carrying paperwork. When he saw Captain Williams, he immediately stopped and saluted her too. "Good morning, Captain," he said with a small smile. She returned the salute and wished him a good morning. It was so normal, so everyday, like buying bread at a store or saying hello to a neighbor. But for Weber, nothing felt normal anymore. He had spent 8 years being taught that this was impossible. Yet it was happening over and over again. White soldiers treated these black women officers the same way German soldiers had treated their commanders. With respect, with obedience, without question. The next shock came 2 hours later in the mess hall. Weber and the other new prisoners sat at long wooden tables, exhausted and confused. Then American soldiers brought out trays of food. Weber stared at his plate and could not believe what he saw. A thick pork chop, bigger than his hand, sat in the center. Next to it was a mountain of mashed potatoes covered in rich brown gravy. Green beans glistened with butter. 2 slices of soft white bread, still warm, came with real butter, not the fake stuff made from chemicals that Germans had been eating for years. On a smaller plate sat a huge slice of apple pie with a golden crust. A glass of cold milk, actually cold, stood sweating in the warm mess hall. Weber later learned this meal contained 3,200 calories, more than double what German civilians were getting in an entire day. His last meal in Germany had been 3 weeks ago. His wife had made thin soup from turnips, water, and a few bits of potato peel. She had given him a piece of black bread that weighed exactly 200 grams because that was the ration, the allowed amount. The bread had been hard and bitter, mixed with sawdust to make the flour stretch further. His children had watched him eat with hungry eyes, but there was nothing more to give them. Now he sat in an enemy prison camp, staring at more food than his family would see in a month. Some of the German prisoners began to cry silently, tears running down their dirty faces as they ate. Others ate so fast they made themselves sick. Weber ate slowly, trying to understand how the country he had been told was weak and dying could have so much food that even prisoners ate like kings. Over the next few days, Weber saw things that broke his brain a little more each time. He was assigned to work in the camp kitchen, which was his first look at American industrial power up close. The kitchen had huge electric mixers that could blend enough dough for 500 loaves of bread in 10 minutes. Back in Germany, bakers mixed everything by hand because there was no electricity in most places anymore. The kitchen had giant refrigerators that kept meat fresh for weeks. Weber had not seen fresh meat since 1943. Every morning, trucks arrived, bringing eggs, milk, vegetables, and beef. The camp went through 800 pounds of potatoes each day. Ice cream was served twice every week, on Wednesday and Saturday nights. German children had not tasted milk in months, and here American prisoners were eating ice cream made from pure cream and sugar. One afternoon, Weber watched a tractor break down near the camp workshop. The engine had seized up and stopped working. He expected American mechanics to spend days taking it apart, cleaning pieces, and trying to fix it, like German mechanics had to do. Instead, 4 soldiers simply lifted out the entire broken engine using a crane and dropped in a brand new one from storage. 4 hours later, the tractor was running again. In Germany, they had been taking parts from 3 broken tanks to make 1 tank work. America just threw away broken things and used new ones. The country had so much it could waste things that Germans would have treasured. Lieutenant Johnson treated the prisoners firmly but fairly. She never yelled. She never hit anyone, which surprised the Germans because they had been told Americans tortured prisoners. When prisoners had questions, she answered them clearly. When someone got sick, she made sure the camp doctor saw them immediately. Captain Williams did something even stranger. She asked if the prisoners wanted books to read. When they said yes, she ordered German language books from somewhere and filled a small library in one of the barracks. She brought them novels, history books, and even some poetry. Why would the enemy give prisoners books? Why would they care if prisoners were bored? Weber started keeping a secret diary, writing on scraps of paper he hid under his mattress. One night he wrote something that scared him because once he wrote it down, he could not pretend he did not think it. He wrote, "How can the people we called subhuman command those we called brothers? How can they have so much when we have nothing?" The questions sat on the paper like small bombs waiting to explode. Deep inside, Weber knew the answer, but he was not ready to admit it yet. Everything he had believed, everything he had fought for, everything he had sacrificed might have been built on lies. That truth was coming for him like a slow wave, and soon he would not be able to run from it anymore. Easter Sunday came on April 1, 1945. Weber woke up that morning not knowing his entire worldview was about to shatter completely. The spring air smelled like fresh pine and new grass. Birds sang outside the barracks windows. It was a beautiful day, the kind of day that felt wrong for what was about to happen inside his head. The camp kitchen had been busy since before dawn, and smells of roasting meat drifted across the grounds. The German prisoners whispered to each other, wondering what was happening. Then, American soldiers called them to the mess hall for a special holiday meal. Weber sat down at his usual table and watched as soldiers brought out plates piled so high with food that it looked unreal, like something from a dream or a painting. Each plate held a golden piece of roasted chicken with crispy skin that crackled when you touched it. Next to the chicken sat a thick slice of glazed ham, shining with sweet brown sugar coating. A huge pile of scalloped potatoes, layered with cream and cheese, took up one whole side of the plate. 3 different vegetables came in small bowls: green beans, glazed carrots, and buttered corn, all fresh and hot. Soft white rolls, still steaming from the oven, came with real butter in little paper cups. For dessert, every prisoner got a massive slice of chocolate cake with dark frosting and a cup of real coffee, not the fake stuff made from acorns that Germans had been drinking for years. Weber later learned this meal contained 4,500 calories, almost 4 times what his family back home was eating in an entire day. He stared at the plate. His hands started to shake. Tears ran down his face, and he could not stop them. Around him, other German prisoners were crying too, some openly sobbing as they ate. One older man prayed quietly in German, thanking God for the food. Another man ate with his head down, his shoulders shaking. They were not crying because they were happy. They were crying because this much food should not exist in a prisoner of war camp. They were crying because their children were starving while they, the defeated enemies, ate like royalty. They were crying because the country they had been told was weak and dying had just served them a feast that would feed a German family for a month. The Nazi lies were drowning in gravy and chocolate frosting, and there was no way to unsee the truth anymore. That afternoon, Captain Williams made an announcement. She said there would be a voluntary educational program in the camp theater. Any prisoner who wanted to attend could come. No one would be forced. No one would be punished for not going. Weber almost did not go. Part of him wanted to hide in his bunk and pretend the morning had not happened. But a bigger part of him needed to know more, needed to understand what was real and what was lies. He walked to the theater with about 80 other prisoners, all of them silent and nervous. The lights went down. A film projector started clicking and whirring. Images appeared on the white screen hanging at the front of the room. At first, Weber did not understand what he was seeing. Piles of something that looked like broken sticks. Then the camera moved closer and his stomach turned to ice. They were not sticks, they were bodies. Human bodies so thin that bones pushed through skin like knives through paper. Mountains of corpses stacked like firewood. Living people who looked like skeletons with skin stretched over them, barely able to stand. Huge pits filled with thousands of dead bodies. The film showed the gates of concentration camps, Bergen-Belsen and Buchenwald, places Weber had heard whispered about but never really believed existed. American and British soldiers had liberated these camps just weeks ago, and they had filmed everything they found. The narrator's voice explained in German what they were seeing. These were Jews, political prisoners, disabled people, Roma people, gay people, anyone the Nazis decided was not worthy of life. The camps had gas chambers disguised as showers. They had crematoriums that burned bodies day and night. They had medical experiments that tortured people to death. The Nazis had built factories of death, and Weber's country, his government, his Führer, had done this. Some prisoners in the theater got up and ran out, unable to watch. Others sat frozen, tears streaming down their faces. Weber's hands gripped the wooden arms of his chair so hard his knuckles turned white. He wanted to look away but forced himself to keep watching. If these people had suffered this, the least he could do was witness it. The least he could do was know the truth. When the film ended, no one spoke. The lights came back on, but everyone just sat there in horrible silence. Weber felt like his insides had been scooped out and replaced with cold stone. Everything he had believed, everything he had fought for, everything he had told himself was for Germany's greatness, had led to this. Mountains of murdered people, children with numbers tattooed on their arms, mass graves. This was what the master race had built. This was the 1,000-year empire. Not glory, not strength, just death and evil on a scale so massive his brain could barely hold it. Later that day, Weber sat alone in the recreation area, staring at nothing. His mind kept showing him the images from the film over and over, like a horrible loop he could not escape. He heard footsteps and looked up. Lieutenant Johnson stood there, holding 2 cups of coffee. She held one out to him. He stood up quickly, automatically showing respect to an officer, something he would have refused to do 4 weeks ago. She noticed, but did not comment. They both sat down. Weber tried to speak, but the words came out broken and wrong. His English was not good, and his thoughts were too big and terrible for any language. He said, "Frau Leutnant, I must say, I was taught, they taught us you were, that black people were." He stopped. How could he say it? How could he admit he had believed she was less than human when she was sitting right there, drinking coffee, having treated him better than his own government ever had. Lieutenant Johnson's voice was calm and kind, which somehow made it worse. She said, "You were taught lies, Captain Weber. We're proving them wrong every day." She took a sip of her coffee and looked at him with eyes that were sad but not angry. She said, "Hate only survives when you keep people separate. Once you see the truth, once you live it, the lies fall apart. That's what's happening to you right now." Weber nodded. He could not speak anymore. She finished her coffee, stood up, and walked away, leaving him alone with his breaking thoughts. That night, he wrote in his diary on a piece of paper torn from a ration box. The date was April 10, 1945. He wrote, "I have been lied to. Everything, the Führer, the party, the Thousand-Year Reich, built on lies. These women we were taught to despise run this facility with more competence than any Wehrmacht headquarters I served in. The white soldiers don't serve them out of fear. They respect them, real respect." He kept writing, the words pouring out like water from a broken dam. "America is not weak because of diversity. America is strong because of it. We called them degenerate while they built an empire of abundance. They have black officers and women officers, and they are winning the war. We have our master race, and we have lost everything." His hand shook as he wrote the last sentence. Propaganda survives by isolation. Once you see the truth, see it, live it, eat it, the lies dissolve. He had spent weeks under the command of competent black women officers. He had watched white soldiers respect them genuinely. He had eaten food that proved America's power. He had seen films that proved Nazi evil. His Nazi worldview could not survive contact with reality. The lies needed darkness to live. Here in Georgia, in a prisoner of war camp run by people he was taught to hate, light had flooded in, and in that light, everything false burned away, leaving only painful, undeniable truth. June 1946. More than a year after the war ended, Weber finally came home to Hamburg. The ship that brought German prisoners back across the Atlantic Ocean was crowded and smelled like unwashed bodies and despair. Weber stood on the deck as the coastline came into view, and his heart sank. He had left Germany in 1944 when it was already damaged by bombs. Now, it was completely destroyed. The harbor was filled with sunken ships, their rusted metal sticking up through the water like broken teeth. Buildings that once stood 5 and 6 stories tall were just piles of bricks and twisted steel. Entire neighborhoods had been flattened. Hamburg looked like the surface of the moon, gray and dead and cratered by explosions. Weber walked through streets he had known his whole life but could barely recognize. Every block brought new shock. The bakery where his mother used to buy bread on Sunday mornings was gone, just a hole in the ground filled with rainwater. The church where he was married was a burned shell with no roof and no windows. Everywhere he looked, people in ragged clothes picked through rubble, looking for anything useful, a pot, a blanket, a brick that was not broken. Children with dirty faces and hollow eyes watched him pass. An old woman pushed a cart made from baby carriage wheels and scrap wood, carrying her entire life in a pile of bundles. This was the master race. This was the great German Empire. Weber wanted to vomit. He found his family living in a basement beneath what used to be an apartment building. The building above was destroyed, but the basement still had 3 walls and part of a ceiling. His wife, Anna, was 30 years old, but looked 50. Her face was thin and gray. Her dress, the same one she had worn since he left for war, now hung on her like a sheet on a stick. Their children, Klaus, who was 9, and little Greta, who was 7, stared at him with huge eyes in tiny faces. They barely remembered him. He had been gone so long he was almost a stranger. The basement was dark and damp. Water dripped from cracks in the ceiling. They had 2 blankets, 1 cooking pot, and almost no food. This was home. Anna cried when she saw him, but they were not happy tears. They were tears of relief mixed with exhaustion and fear. She asked him if he had brought food. He had not been allowed to bring anything from the camp. He had nothing to give them except himself, and what good was that? That night they ate thin soup made from potato peels and some kind of grain Anna had gotten by trading her wedding ring. The children got most of it. Weber's portion fit in a teacup. He thought about the Easter meal at Fort Oglethorpe, the chicken and ham and cake, and shame burned in his stomach like acid. He had eaten better as a prisoner than his children ate as free people. But Weber had brought something home, even though it was dangerous. Hidden in the lining of his jacket was a photograph. He had risked punishment to keep it, had hidden it during searches, had protected it like treasure. One night, after the children were asleep, he showed Anna the picture. It showed the Fort Oglethorpe administrative staff standing in front of the processing building. Lieutenant Johnson and Captain Williams stood in the front row, their uniforms crisp and perfect, their faces proud and professional. Behind them stood white soldiers and black soldiers together, all looking straight at the camera with confidence. Anna held the photograph close to the candle so she could see it better. Her hands shook slightly. She asked quietly, "What was America like?" Her voice was careful, like she was afraid of the answer. Weber did not know how to explain. How could he describe abundance to someone who was starving? How could he describe equality to someone who had been fed Nazi lies for 12 years? He decided to start with the simple truth. He said, "They have black women as officers. I took orders from them, and they treated me better than our own government ever did." Anna studied the photograph for a long time. Her finger traced the outline of Lieutenant Johnson's face. Finally, she asked the question that mattered most. Her voice was almost a whisper. "Were they good officers?" Weber felt tears come to his eyes. He nodded and said, "They were excellent. That's what I couldn't accept at first. That's what broke me open and showed me the truth." The next morning, Klaus found the photograph and asked his father about it. Weber sat his son down and told him everything. He told him about the salute that changed his world. He told him about the food, the respect, the competence of people the Nazis had called subhuman. He told his son that everything they had been taught was a lie, and that lies had destroyed Germany. He told Klaus that he had to be better, had to learn from this, had to never let hate and propaganda trick him the way it had tricked millions of Germans. Klaus listened with wide eyes, and Weber saw understanding growing in his son's face like a flower opening to sunlight. Weber spent the rest of his life making up for the years he had believed lies. He joined German-American reconciliation societies, groups that worked to build friendship between the two countries that had been enemies. He spoke at schools, telling students about Fort Oglethorpe and the black women officers who commanded with excellence. He spoke at churches, explaining how propaganda had poisoned his generation and warning them to never let it happen again. He became a loud voice against right-wing extremism whenever it tried to grow again in Germany. Some people called him a traitor, others threatened him. He did not care. He had seen the truth, and he would not be silent about it. In 1983, 3 years before he died, a journalist interviewed Weber for a newspaper article about former prisoners of war. Weber was 70 years old, his hair white and his back bent. But his mind was sharp, and his voice was strong when he talked about Fort Oglethorpe. The journalist asked him what he learned from his time as a prisoner. Weber thought for a moment, then spoke words he had spent 40 years thinking about. He said, "I was taught that people could be judged by their race, their sex, their blood. America showed me that people should be judged by their competence, their character, their humanity. Those black women officers saved more than my life. They saved my soul. They showed me that the future belonged not to tyrants who divide people, but to democracies that unite them. The most powerful weapon against hate is not force. It is truth. Those German prisoners came to America expecting monsters and found human beings. They expected weakness and found strength. They expected chaos and found competence. Lieutenant Mary Johnson and Captain Ruth Williams never fired a gun in World War II, but they won a battle far more important than any fought with bullets. They defeated evil ideology with simple excellence. They defeated hate with quiet professionalism. They defeated the Nazi lie simply by existing and thriving and being undeniably good at their jobs. Sometimes the most radical act, the most revolutionary thing a person can do, is simply being themselves, being competent, being professional, being proudly and completely themselves in a world that says they should not exist. Those two black women officers stood at the gate of a prison camp in Georgia and changed the minds of men who had been taught to hate them. They did it not with speeches or force, but just by being excellent at their work. They proved that human worth has nothing to do with skin color or gender. They proved it so completely that even men poisoned by Nazi hate could not deny it once they saw it with their own eyes. Weber carried that lesson home to his destroyed country and spent 40 years teaching it to anyone who would listen. The photograph stayed with his family. His children showed it to their children. His grandchildren showed it to their children. And each generation heard the story of the day their grandfather learned that everything he believed was wrong, and how that terrible, beautiful truth saved his soul and taught him what it really means to be human.